I'd like to be able to claim that, the muse just shows up and I just sit down and it goes. The truth of the matter is, in this case, originally I was going to write a short story for Thomas and Mercer, and that they'd asked me to do a story, and I didn't really have any ideas, but I knew that I wanted to be a heist, and I was at my sister's house, and I was talking to my nephew, who was in law school at the time, and he'd been interviewing at all these different law firms and stuff. And I was like, "Is there anything weird that you saw at any of these law firms?" And he said, "Well, no." He's like, "Well, no, there was the one place I saw that had the entire floor of safe deposit boxes." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, I guess it's becoming more and more prevalent because the feds can't get into them. They're covered by attorney-client privilege. You're not going to go rob a law firm for the safe deposit." So he's telling me all this, like we're sitting in my sister's kitchen drinking coffee, and he's telling me this, and literally it's just like, whoa. And I said, "Well, did you meet the guy that was in charge?" He's like, "Oh yeah, he was cool. His name was Jeff." And I was like, Jeff is in charge of all these people's safe deposit boxes." I said, "What's his story?" He's like, "Well, I don't think he's a lawyer." And so as soon as my nephew said these words to me, um, it was all right there. Like I knew what it was going to be. I wanted someone to heist safe deposit boxes, get away with it, and this is no spoiler. This is the first 10 pages of the book. Crash his car in front of a crooked cop and have the cop steal the loot. Um, like that came to me right then as we were doing it. Um, and then I pitched this idea to Thomas and Mercer, and they were like, "This sounds fantastic for the short story, but instead we'd really prefer it to be a novel." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's a champagne problem. Sure, that seems like something I could do." And now, in retrospect, I have no idea how I would have made it work as a 40-page short story or something. So in that case, it all just came from there. And then, the rest of the stuff that happens, that's just my broken brain. So, for the last decade, I've been writing, or more than a decade, I wrote, about a hitman rabbi in Las Vegas. And that is a completely different kind of place than a small, dilapidated resort town on the Oregon coast. Um, and I wanted to be able to write a smaller story than I had written before. Those gangster books, it's, big, far-reaching conspiracy, all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to tell a little story that is emblematic of something larger that's going on, in the world that would cause people to, want to steal money or want to disappear or want to get famous. And also, I don't know about you, but essentially subsequent to the pandemic, I became obsessed with every one of those small town true crime shows that play at midnight, where it's like I never would have expected someone to cut someone up and freeze them in my hometown. And it's like, sweetheart, there are people getting cut up and frozen everywhere. So I knew that I wanted to write about a small town. I knew I wanted to not have to worry about all the surveillance and all the good cops and all that. So all that was absolutely intentional, because I think the thing about resort towns, living in one, I live in Palm Springs. I'm not there right now, but I live in Palm Springs. Is there something really insidious about a place where everyone that you encounter is there for your good time? And I never believe it. Like, I never believe anyone in a resort town is happy to see me. They just want to go home and, eat popcorn and watch television. And so I love to write about places where no one is exactly what they seem because they're being paid to be nice to you. I love that. For me, that's catnip. So yeah, putting a story like this in a dilapidated resort town with these kinds of characters, these sort of small town people, that for me was just a lot of fun to do.
And so, in that spirit, who are any of your favorite supporting cast that among the locals that colored this story with, so to speak?
Um, you know, I love the character of Addie. So Addie is a teenager at the beginning of the book who Robert and Penny have conscripted into their con. And then you meet her 15 years later, and she's one of these people with a true crime podcast and who spins conspiracy theories and all that. She's actually, I wrote a chapter of this as a short story that, in fact, is in Best American Mystery Stories this year. And after I wrote that chapter as a short story, I was like, oh, I really love this teenage girl. Like, she's really smart and sassy and weird, and she was goth, and I liked that. And so I love to write about someone who, um, sort of says exactly what they mean all the time. They have no subtext. And Addie is a character that has no subtext. She says exactly what she wants to say. And so I love writing a character like that. But then, there's just little small things. Like there's a character at the very beginning of part two of the book named Yard Shittin' Sam, who you only see for, 10 pages or something. But this is a scene that takes place in the high desert, and he's based on a character that I know, a guy who was notorious for shitting in people's yards. And so that's the kind of person you only really find in the desert. And so I wanted to drop someone like that in. But for me, I try to write every character in a book as though they are the main character. So that when you encounter someone who's a minor character in any given scene, they say enough or do enough that you start to really wonder, like, who are they? What are they about? Could they have their own story? And a character like Addie, she really she comes alive to me because I just wonder about the pathology of a person like that. So Jack Biddle is the crooked cop, and I really wanted to write about a guy who's just sort of vainglorious, who is always imagining a street to be named for him, or that he'll be on the Mount Rushmore of his town, whatever that might look like. Because growing up in Palm Springs, you run into like a lot of locals who have this notion of themselves because they're big in this resort town that they are some kind of celebrity. My mom was kind of like that. My mom in Palm Springs was the society columnist for the local paper. And so people really sort of bent over backwards for her because they wanted to see their name in bold type in the newspaper. But it affected her in a very negative way, well, from my perception, because she began to believe that people really admired her and adored her when really what they wanted was to see their name in the paper. And there was one year where she got it in her mind that she was going to run for mayor. And, we had to subtly tell her, like, if you run for mayor, people are going to realize you didn't actually graduate from college, and that's going to be embarrassing for you, and you're going to have to quit your job. This is the 80s and 90s. They didn't really check people's CVs very closely. So a character like Jack Biddle, a vainglorious guy who wants a parade in his name and all that, and who's got a gambling problem, and who comes across a dead body and decides, well, I can use this for my own good. Um, I love to write a character like that. Because he's both a wild card and someone that you should pity in a way, but he absorbs your pity. He thinks pity is glory. And we've all known people like that. We probably have a stepdad. All of us have a stepdad like this. And so I love to write about a guy like Jack. And he's the villain of the book, but he thinks he's the hero, which I find fun to write. And then, Mitch Diamond, who is this ex-con who also is not who he seems to be, who sort of stumbles into a job at a law firm as a fixer because another former fixer has died. I think of him as the kind of character I write really well. A person that maybe is comfortable with violence, is quick-witted, and is more competent than you are. And I think about that a lot, like competency, like what it's like when someone who thinks they're a badass runs into a real badass. And you see this, like, there's a whole niche of YouTube videos, right? Of like, bully meets UFC fighter, and you're like, well, I know how this is going to end. It's going to be very gratifying. And so Mitch is one of those characters for me of, he's been a crook. He's now sort of working somewhat on a legitimate job, but he's also doing some illegal things. But he's the kind of guy that can get you what you need. And if he likes you, he's not going to hurt you. And for me, that's this beautiful loser that I think I've written about a lot over the course of the last, 25 years of my life. A guy that you should cross the street to get away from, but who you can't stop watching. Right away for the reader to empathize with them. If they're just a loser, then you pity them. You like they do Jack Biddle. Jack Biddle, you pity him, but you also understand him because other people love him. He's incapable of love, but other people love him. With a character like Mitch, or in my previous books, like the Rabbi David Cohen, Sal Cupertine character, you give this person a code, and you give this person emotion, give them someone that they care about, someone that they love. Well, now suddenly they're human beings. They're your cousin who's a fuck up. They're your friend who makes bad decisions, whatever it might be, taken to the extreme, obviously, inside of a book. And so the secret to writing these losers is not to redeem them necessarily, but to make it impossible for them to walk away from the consequences of their actions, but also have them be changed by the consequences of their actions. They might not be changed for the better, but they'll be changed.